The first thing worth saying, before any of the history, is why a bar gunner became the single most targeted man in an American rifle squad. It was not mystique, it was mechanics. The weapon he carried fired at a rate no other shoulder arm in the squad could match, and every soldier on the other side of the line knew that. If you were a German infantryman in 1944 or a Japanese rifleman in the Pacific, you had been trained to one priority above most others in a close-range fight. Silence the automatic weapon first, not the officer, not the radio, the gun. Without it, the squad on the other side lost most of its ability to suppress you, and that meant you could maneuver or dig in or pull back without being pinned. That is the tactical problem at the center of this story, and everything else follows from it. The bar gunner had two features that made him impossible to hide. The first was the muzzle flash, visibly larger than a Garand's at any range worth firing at. The second was the sound signature, a burst of full auto .30-06 carried differently than a rifle shot. Every veteran on the receiving end of American fire learned that difference within their first engagement. So the moment the bayar opened up, the enemy did not need to see the gunner to know roughly where he was. They already knew. What that meant in practice was that the man carrying the squad's primary firepower was, by the nature of his job, advertising his location every time he did that job. What stands out to me about that setup is how little room it leaves for the individual man's judgment. He could not choose not to fire. The squad needed the suppression. He also could not fire without being seen. The job, as designed, did not offer both options. That is the role we will work through. What it was, how it evolved, and what it cost the men who filled it. I want to be honest with you about the sources as we go, because some of what gets repeated about the BAR in the popular literature is well documented, and some of it rests on veteran testimony that is not statistically tight. I will flag the difference where it matters. Good evening, and thanks for being here. Settle in if you want to. I want to start with a number that I would handle carefully, but that keeps surfacing in the secondary literature. One estimate that appears in veteran accounts and post-war unit discussions is roughly 30 minutes of active combat life for a bar gunner in a hot engagement. I would not defend that figure as rigorous statistics. Veteran estimates compress, the sample is self-selecting, and the records are not clean. What matters to me is not the exact number, but the fact that it survived at all. If the men who were there were willing to repeat 30 minutes in letters, in memoirs, in interviews decades later, you can take it as an honest reflection of how exposed they felt. The measured truth is probably somewhere in the same neighborhood. We just cannot put a tight confidence interval on it. The starting point, then, is not the gun. It is the target on the man's back. Every infantry army fighting on European soil in the 20th century understood one tactical priority more than almost any other. Kill the automatic gun first. The automatic weapon is the center of gravity for a squad. Remove it, and the squad's firepower drops by an order of magnitude. In practice, that meant a veteran German infantryman in 1944 who heard a bar open up across a hedgerow did not look for an officer. He looked for the muzzle flash, and he called every weapon within reach onto that flash as fast as his voice could travel. The bar gunner knew this. He carried a 20-pound weapon that announced his position the moment he pulled the trigger, and he kept firing anyway because if he stopped firing, his squad died. That is the reality we will work through slowly, because it does not make sense all at once. It makes sense when you start with where the weapon came from, what it was supposed to do, and what the war turned it into. John Moses Browning was from Ogden, Utah, a gunsmith's son who had been designing firearms since he was a teenager. By 1910, he had produced pistols, shotguns, and machine guns that would stay in production for a century or more. In that year, he began sketching what he called a machine rifle, a shoulder-fired automatic weapon that could give one man something close to the firepower of a crew-served gun. The idea did not get immediate traction. The United States Army in 1910 did not know what to do with automatic weapons. The whole category of light machine gun barely existed as a doctrine in America. The French were experimenting, the Germans were experimenting, the British were experimenting. The United States had a handful of Maxim and Colt Browning guns and a philosophical preference for accurate riflemen over sprayed fire. Then the war came, not for the Americans immediately, for the Europeans first, and for the Americans as a growing inevitability. By late 1916, with trench warfare grinding into its second year in France, the United States military finally started taking seriously the possibility that it might have to send troops into that specific kind of fighting. When it looked at what it would send them with, it realized something uncomfortable. The United States did not have a light automatic weapon worth the name. The French Chauchat, which American troops would eventually be issued, was widely considered one of the worst firearms ever pressed into mass service. The Benet Mercier was fragile and awkward. Something better was needed, and it was needed fast. On February 27, 1917, about 5 weeks before the United States declared war on Germany, John Browning drove to Washington and staged a live fire demonstration at a place called Congress Heights, just south of the city. He brought 2 weapons. One was a water-cooled heavy machine gun that would later become the M1917 Browning. The other was the shoulder-fired automatic rifle he had been developing since 1910. About 300 people watched. Military officers, senators, congressmen, reporters, foreign attachés. Browning fired the automatic rifle, and the army signed a contract within weeks. Historians have been pointing out a long-running frustration with what happened next. The army had the weapon. The contract was signed. Production should have started in the spring of 1917. It did not. The first bars did not reach France until the middle of 1918. The first combat use was September 22nd of that year, with the 79th Infantry Division in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, 2 months before the armistice. By the time the war ended, only around 85,000 had been delivered, and most never saw combat. The army, worried the Germans might capture one and copy the design, had actively restricted front-line deployment. A weapon that could have shaped the entire last year of the war on the Western Front was issued with such caution that most American soldiers never laid hands on one. What I think the army got wrong here was not the concern about capture. That was a reasonable fear. What they got wrong was the waiting. They valued the security of the design more than the lives the weapon could have saved if it had been in squads for 6 more months. That is a kind of institutional risk aversion that shows up repeatedly in military procurement, and it shows up here first. The ones who did get the weapon talked about it. A corporal in the 36th Division wrote home in early November 1918, describing the most interesting thing he had seen in combat: a German airplane brought down by a Browning automatic rifle. That was not the weapon's designed role. It was not in any manual. It was a man firing a shoulder rifle at an aircraft and hitting it because the rate of fire and the caliber were enough to do the work. The weapon had not even finished its first month in combat, and it was already becoming mythic. There was an idea floating around in that period called walking fire. It came out of French trench doctrine. Men would advance across no man's land while firing automatic weapons from the hip, suppressing the enemy trench line while the rifle squads closed the distance. Browning designed the original bar with this in mind, and the army issued gunners a special belt with a leather cup that cradled the butt of the rifle against the hip to make hip fire more controllable. On paper, that sounds reasonable. In practice, French veterans of walking fire had already figured out by 1917 that it was mostly suicidal. The German machine gunners were too good. The distances were too long. The only men who tried it in the open for any length of time were the ones who did not come back. The leather cup quietly disappeared from the kit. The walking fire concept would resurface decades later in the assault rifle idea. In 1918, it died on the ground where it was invented. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, the BAR went home with the American Expeditionary Force, and then it more or less sat on a shelf for 20 years. The interwar army was small, budgets were starved. Ordnance officers tinkered with the design, a bipod added here, a modification there, but there was no fundamental redesign. In 1937, the M1918A1 was adopted, which bolted a bipod and a hinged buttplate onto the existing gun. In 1940, with war already burning in Europe and Asia, the M1918A2 was standardized. That version would be the one carried into the Second World War. The M1918A2 did something strange. It eliminated the semi-automatic fire mode entirely. The original BAR could fire single shots or full automatic. The 1940 version removed the single shot option and replaced it with 2 cyclic rates of full automatic fire. A slow rate of around 300 to 450 rounds per minute, a fast rate of around 500 to 650. That was the only selection the gunner had. If he wanted single shots, he had to squeeze the trigger for an instant and release, fine motor control under combat stress, and hope he got 1 round before the burst started. This is where the official doctrine and battlefield reality split in a concrete way. Gun historians have argued about this decision for 8 decades. Why remove semi-automatic? The answer appears to be doctrinal. By 1940, the Army had stopped thinking of the BAR as an automatic rifle and started thinking of it as a light machine gun, a squad support weapon. Light machine guns do not fire single shots. They fire in bursts, so the option got cut. What that meant in practice is that in 1944, a BAR gunner in a Normandy hedgerow who wanted to take a single precise shot at a German moving through a gap in the brush actually could not cleanly. The Marines noticed this immediately and had their armorers modify the selectors to restore semi-auto capability. The Corps used the weapon the way it had been originally designed. The Army used it the way the 1940 manual told them to. A small thing, a technical detail, but it opened a gap between how 2 branches of the American military would carry the same weapon into the same war. The physical reality shaped every choice made around the weapon. The M1918A2, loaded with a 20-round magazine, weighed around 20 pounds. For comparison, the M1 Garand, the standard American battle rifle, weighed about 9.5 pounds fully loaded. A BAR gunner was carrying more than twice the weight of a standard rifleman's shoulder weapon, before you added the spare magazines. Each magazine held 20 rounds of .30-06 ammunition. The same cartridge the Garand fired, which mattered for logistics, but a BAR magazine loaded weighed around 1.5 pounds. A gunner typically carried 12 magazines in a belt, plus additional bandoliers. Another 20 pounds of ammunition, easily strapped to his waist and shoulders. Total weight on a BAR gunner moving into combat, 40 pounds, sometimes more. Add his helmet, canteen, grenades, pack, entrenching tool, poncho, rations. A BAR gunner in combat moved with roughly 65 to 70 pounds of gear on his body. And he had to move faster than the rifleman next to him because the squad depended on him keeping up. This is where the BAR stops being just a weapon and becomes a tactical burden one man has to carry for the whole squad. Before you factor in enemy fire at all, the physical cost of being the gunner was already punishing. Veterans described body damage that followed them into civilian life. A 19-year-old man in 1943 who carried a BAR across North Africa, Sicily, and up through Italy was a man with chronic spinal problems at 30. It was not recorded as a combat injury, it simply was. The Standard Army Infantry Squad in 1941 consisted of 12 men, then reorganized mid-war to 9 men, with 1 BAR in the squad. Just 1. The Army did not believe in saturating a squad with automatic weapons. The BAR was there to provide a base of fire while the 11, later 8, M1 Garand riflemen maneuvered. Doctrine said the BAR covered. The riflemen advanced. Everything about how the American infantry fought was built on that assumption. The Marine Corps, watching the Pacific War unfold, came to a different conclusion. By 1944, a Marine rifle squad was 13 men organized into 3 4-man fire teams, with 1 bar per fire team, 3 bars per squad. The Marines inverted the Army's doctrine. The bar was the center of the squad, and the riflemen were there to protect it and feed it. The numbers reflect the shift. By 1945, a Marine division fielded 867 BARs. A 1943 Marine division had 513. The Marines had looked at the Pacific and decided that automatic firepower was more valuable per man than almost anything else you could put in a hand. What this actually tells you about infantry combat is something the 2 branches figured out by running the same experiment with different answers. The Army's version assumed the riflemen were the core of the fight. The Marines' version assumed the automatic weapon was. Both branches were right for their theater. What strikes me is that neither branch moved toward the other's model, even after sharing the Pacific for years. Institutional inertia beat cross-branch learning. Who actually got the bar in a squad? Official doctrine said a physically strong soldier. The weapon was heavy and the recoil under full auto was substantial. Unofficial selection was messier. Often the BAR went to the largest man in the squad because of the weight. Sometimes to the best shot because the weapon was genuinely accurate at range. Sometimes to the man who happened to be standing in the wrong spot when the previous gunner got hit because nobody else wanted it. That last category is where the grim part lives. The bar changed hands often. The 3-man bar team at the start of the war was the gunner, an assistant gunner who carried additional magazines, and an ammunition bearer. The assistant gunner and ammunition bearer were supposed to be close at all times, because if the gunner went down, the assistant picked up the weapon and continued firing. By late 1944, in many Army units, the 3-man team had been abandoned. The gunner worked alone, with the rest of the squad carrying his spare magazines. Not because doctrine changed, because casualties made the old structure untenable. 3 men in a cluster drew the same fire. Units spread the ammunition load across the squad because the old arrangement was a funeral formation. And every man in the squad was trained to fire the BAR, because statistically, over the course of a campaign, several of them were going to have to pick it up. One name worth pausing on: Private Charles N. de Glopper, 22 years old, from Grand Island, New York, Company C, 1st Battalion, 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. On the morning of June 9, 1944, 3 days after D-Day, his platoon was pinned down in a ditch at the village of Coquigny, just west of the Merderet River on the Cotentin Peninsula. The Germans had worked around the flank and were closing in. De Glopper understood what was about to happen. He stood up out of the ditch, walked into the roadway with his bar and opened fire, drawing every German rifle and machine gun in the area onto himself so his platoon could withdraw. He was hit almost immediately. He kept firing. He was hit again. He dropped to one knee and kept firing. His platoon got out. He did not. When his squad recovered his body later, they found German dead around him and a pile of empty bar magazines at his feet. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His decision-making in those 2 minutes is one of the clearest illustrations in the war of what the bar was supposed to do and what it cost the man who used it that way. The weapon gave a single man the firepower to cover a platoon's withdrawal, and that single man, more often than not, did not live through the action. A second name: Private First Class Henry Schauer, 3rd Infantry Division, 1944, Italy. Schauer's engagement has become one of the most discussed bar actions of the war, not for sacrifice but for marksmanship. Standing in the open under German fire, he used his BAR as an automatic rifle in the truest sense. He killed 2 German machine gunners at close range, 2 more Germans who ran to replace them at roughly 60 yards, 4 German infantrymen at 500 yards, and then, separately, 5 snipers at various ranges, all with the same weapon. He reloaded under fire throughout. Most of those shots were at distances most armies considered well outside the effective range of a squad automatic weapon. Schauer was a rifleman who happened to have a BAR, and the BAR let him do things no other shoulder weapon in the squad could do. He received the Medal of Honor for that action, and his story reveals something the doctrine writers in 1940 had missed. The bar, in the hands of a skilled shooter, was not only a machine gun, it was also an accurate long-range rifle. Veterans who carried it for extended periods learned to work inside that duality. Burst fire when a squad needed suppression. Aimed single shots when targets presented at distance. Even without the semi-automatic switch, a skilled gunner could tap the trigger and release before the second round cycled. Not technically single shot in effect. Europe, summer of 1944. The specific terrain that turned the bar into something the Germans eventually feared. The hedgerows of Normandy, the bocage. If you have never seen the Norman bocage, it is almost impossible to picture from a photograph. These were not English-style decorative hedges. They were earthen embankments, half earth and half vegetation, built by centuries of French farmers to divide small, irregular fields. The embankments were typically 4 to 6 feet high. The vegetation on top, brambles, thorns, saplings, added another 8 to 10 feet, sometimes more. Total height, 15 feet in some places. The fields they bordered were small, irregular, maybe 200 yards across on the longest side. The Germans, who had occupied Normandy for 4 years, had woven defensive positions into these hedgerows, machine gun nests dug into the banks, overhead cover, communication trenches between positions. Every field was a potential kill zone. Every opening in a hedgerow was already zeroed in by German weapons sighted on the other side. The American planners had not expected this. Aerial reconnaissance had shown the hedgerows, but the photographs did not show scale. Officers looking at the images had imagined something like English countryside. The men who landed on the beaches and pushed inland found something else. They found a maze of roofless rooms, each one defended by veterans, each one requiring its own assault. The BAR became central to how those assaults worked. American squads developed a rough tactic on the ground, not from a manual, from trial and blood. 2 men would crawl into position at one edge of the hedgerow. The bar gunner would set up to suppress the German position on the opposite side of the field. The rifleman would push through the gap or flank the position. The bar's role was to put enough fire into the German machine gun nest to keep the gunner's head down for the 10 or 12 seconds the squad needed to move. A company commander of the 12th Infantry Regiment wrote in his after-action report that heavy automatic fire, specifically from BARs, was the best way to flush out hedgerows. That assessment got written into the Army's combat lessons pamphlets in 1944 and distributed back to units across Europe. A platoon leader of the 79th Infantry Division recommended 2 bar teams and an additional Thompson submachine gun per squad for hedgerow fighting. The Army doctrine of 1 bar per squad was quietly being abandoned in the field. Units were acquiring 2nd and sometimes 3rd BARs, sometimes from casualties, sometimes by informal trade, sometimes by going back to a rear supply point with a written request and refusing to leave without one. A German infantryman writing about Normandy, his account preserved through interrogation reports, described the American bar in language that suggested they initially mistook it for a machine gun. The weapon's rate of fire, its sound, and the volume the Americans could produce with multiple BARs on one hedgerow created an impression heavier than a shoulder weapon, and the Germans kept noting with something approaching frustration that by the time they brought their own machine gun fire onto a BAR position, the American had already moved and was shooting from somewhere else. The comparison cuts hard here. The weapon was mobile in a way that the MG-42, a much better weapon in raw firepower, could not match. An MG-42 team needed 3 men, a tripod or bipod, and belts of ammunition. A bar needed 1 man with a 20-round magazine. Over the span of a firefight, that mobility was decisive. There is an uncomfortable truth the American infantry lived with in 1944. The German MG-42 was the better weapon, flat out better as a light machine gun. It fired at around 1,200 rounds per minute, more than double the bar's rate. It had a quick change barrel, the bar did not. It was belt-fed, so it could sustain fire for long periods. American soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw for a reason. The sound of an MG-42 firing was unlike any other weapon on the Western Front. A ripping cloth noise that came so fast the individual reports blurred into one continuous sound. The bar could not compete with an MG-42 in a direct fire duel at range. It was not supposed to. The American solution was not to match the MG-42. It was to maneuver against it. 3 riflemen with M1 Garands, a BAR and mortar support from the weapons platoon would work around an MG-42 position while the BAR suppressed. The MG-42 was fixed to its tripod or tree stump. The BAR could move every 20 seconds if the gunner was good. Over the course of a battle of maneuver, which is what Normandy became once the Americans broke out of the Hedgerows in late July, the bar's mobility started to matter more than the MG-42's rate of fire. And that trade-off only worked if the bar gunner lived long enough to execute it. The weight problem remained the most immediate lived reality for every man who carried the weapon. American GIs in the Hedgerows almost universally started stripping their bars. The bipod came off first. The flash hider often came off second. The carrying handle, which had been added in 1942 but was considered unbalanced and a hindrance to accuracy, came off third. By late 1944, a bar carried by an infantryman in France or Italy might look quite different from the factory-issued weapon, lighter, more awkward, but significantly more portable. The Marines in the Pacific did the same thing, earlier and more aggressively. Nearly every Marine bar gunner stripped his bipod. Most stripped the flash hider. Some stripped parts of the buttstock. The weapon went from 20 pounds to somewhere around 16 or 17, which does not sound like much until you have carried the difference for 12 hours through a jungle. The bipod had a purpose. That was the trade. The bipod allowed prone fire at distance. Without it, the bar became a harder weapon to stabilize when firing full auto. The gunner gave up accuracy at range to gain mobility in the close fight. Whether that was the right trade-off depended entirely on where he was fighting. In open country, Holland, eastern France, northern Italy, the bipod was worth keeping. In the hedgerows and jungles, almost nobody kept it. There was an official Marine Corps report from the 4th Marine Division after the Saipan campaign that mentioned, as one of the very few places in the record it happened, that Marines there actually preferred BARs with the bipod. Most after-action reports from the Pacific say the opposite. The Saipan report is an outlier, and that is a useful piece of evidence in itself. The trade-off was not universal even within a single branch. Good units adapted their kit to their specific terrain and their specific mission, not to a standing order. The Pacific War changed the BAR's role more than any other theater. Jungle fighting collapsed engagement distances. Most Pacific firefights happened at under 50 yards. Some happened at 3 yards. Visibility was sometimes measured in feet. In those conditions, the bar's accuracy at range was mostly irrelevant. What mattered was rate of fire, magazine capacity, reliability in humid and muddy environments, and the shock effect of 20 rounds of .30-06 hitting something at close distance. The bar performed well on all of those, though the 20-round magazine was a genuine frustration. Every Marine bar gunner in the Pacific carried more magazines than the belt was designed for, stuffing them into pockets, pouches, musette bags, anywhere he could reach them without looking down. Marine doctrine in the Pacific evolved around the bar in a way that no other army's doctrine evolved around its light machine gun. The 13-man squad was explicitly built to maximize bar firepower. 3 fire teams, 3 bars. The riflemen in each fire team were, in practice if not always in writing, protecting the bar gunner and getting him into firing positions. That is an inversion of the European model. In Europe, the bar supported the rifle advance. In the Pacific, the rifle squad supported the bar advance. On Peleliu in the fall of 1944, the 1st Marine Division landed on an island General Rupertus had predicted would be secured in 4 days. It took more than 2 months. The Japanese defense under Colonel Nakagawa had abandoned the beach defense doctrine of earlier Pacific battles. Instead, they had built a honeycomb of caves and tunnels through the Umabrogal Ridge, 500 limestone caves linked by tunnels, some fitted with sliding armored doors. The fighting was close, dirty, and cave by cave. Flamethrowers became essential, so did BARs. A marine fire team approaching a cave mouth needed a base of fire to cover the flamethrower team's approach. The bar was that base of fire. If the bar went down, the flamethrower operator went down seconds later. What strikes me about Peleliu and about the Pacific generally is that the casualty statistics alone do not tell the whole story. Visibility mattered as much as lethality. Marine casualty reports from Peleliu do not always break out bar gunners specifically. The 1st Marine Division took something close to 6,500 casualties in 60 days. The division was functionally destroyed. It had to be relieved in mid-campaign by the Army's 81st Infantry Division. In a division of roughly 17,000 men, 6,500 casualties means almost 40% of the force. For bar gunners, whose job made them conspicuous on purpose, the rate was almost certainly higher. How much higher is hard to pin down in the unit records, but the pattern holds across all of the major marine campaigns. On Iwo Jima, on Okinawa, on Guadalcanal, in the Solomon Islands, the men carrying BARs were dying or being wounded at rates the rest of the squad was not matching. There is a report from the 4th Marine Division on Iwo Jima that is worth reading carefully. The report observes that with early combat casualties, it was rarely possible to man all 3 BARs in a squad with experienced BAR gunners. The specialist training was getting wiped out too fast for the replacement system to keep up. Units were falling back on riflemen who had been trained at the basic level to operate the weapon. Those men were not expert bar gunners. They could keep the weapon firing. They could service the rough functions. But they were not, in the language of the report, expert. The report recommended reducing the number of BARs per squad rather than trying to fill gunner slots with inexperienced men. Whether that recommendation was adopted is hard to say. The Marine Corps kept its 3-bar squad for the rest of the war. But the observation itself is telling. The training pipeline could not produce bar gunners as fast as combat was consuming them. Back to the 30-minute figure, briefly. That number surfaces from sources that are not rigorous statistics, but it matches what the unit records keep saying in different language across different theaters. The men were not surviving. I am comfortable saying that without committing to a specific number. December 1944, a small village in the Ardennes called Lanzerath. On December 16, 1944, the German army launched its last major offensive on the Western Front, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. An 18-man intelligence and reconnaissance platoon from the 394th Regiment of the 99th Infantry Division was sitting in foxholes on a ridge above Lanzerath when the offensive began. The platoon was commanded by a 20-year-old lieutenant named Lyle Bouck. Bouck's platoon had 3 BARs. They had rifle grenades. They had a .50 caliber machine gun on a jeep. 18 of them were about to face off against an entire German paratrooper battalion. The German battalion advanced toward Lanzerath in the open. Bouck's men held their fire and waited. When the German point element was close enough, inside 300 yards, Buch's platoon opened up. Bars, rifles, grenades, the .50 caliber. The Germans went down in clumps. They regrouped. They advanced again. They went down again and again. For most of the day, Buch's platoon held that ridge for almost 20 hours against a force more than 20 times its size. They stopped the German advance on that sector of the front for most of a day that, at the operational level, helped disrupt the German timetable for the entire offensive. When they finally ran out of ammunition and were overrun, they had inflicted casualties on the German battalion that were, by any honest reckoning, grotesquely disproportionate to their numbers. The BARs in Buch's foxholes did most of the killing. 3 weapons. 3 gunners who kept firing through hours of German assault. When the platoon was captured and sent to German POW camps, the Germans did not know what they had. The men were classified as routine prisoners. It took more than 30 years and a lot of quiet post-war advocacy by the survivors before the United States officially recognized what the 394th Platoon had done at Lanzerath. When the recognition came, it made that 18-man platoon one of the most decorated small units in American military history. The bar was the reason the math worked. You hear about Bastogne in the Bulge. You hear about Piper's Panzers. You do not usually hear about Buch's platoon. But if you want to understand what a bar in skilled hands could do when the situation was desperate, that is where the story lives. Zoom out for a second. By 1945, the United States had manufactured more than 500,000 Browning automatic rifles across all variants. They were everywhere the American infantry was. Every Army rifle squad had one. Every Marine fire team had one. They were in North Africa with Patton, in Sicily, up the Italian peninsula, in the French countryside, in the German forests, in the Pacific atolls, in the Philippine jungles, in occupation duty in Japan and Germany after the surrender. The weapon accompanied the American soldier from the first landings in 1942 to the last combat engagements in 1945 and onward into Korea and Vietnam. Manufacturing went primarily to Winchester and New England small arms during the war, with production contracts also going to international business machines. The same IBM you know from computers, though in 1943 they were making rifles and carbines. The weapon was relatively expensive to produce. It had a lot of machined parts. A single bar required roughly the same manufacturing time as 2 M1 Garands. That cost was one of the reasons the Army kept the squad allocation at 1 bar per 9 men. The Marine Corps paid the higher price gladly for its 3-bar squad. The round the bar fired, the .30-06 Springfield, was the same round fired by the M1 Garand, the M1903 Springfield rifle, and the M1919 machine guns. That commonality was enormous for American logistics. A supply chain carrying 1 rifle caliber across all infantry weapons was simpler and more resilient than the mixed caliber supply chains most other armies were running. A German squad might need 7.92mm rifle rounds for the Kar 98K, 7.92mm belt ammunition for the MG42, and 9mm pistol ammunition for the MP40. An American squad needed .30-06 for the Garand, .30-06 for the BAR, and .30-06 for the squad's rifle grenades. Magazine versus clip versus belt made a difference on the logistics side, but the cartridge was the same. In a logistics war, and the Second World War was profoundly a logistics war, that simplicity mattered. Something the casual history often misses. The bar could pierce light armor. Rounds from a bar could penetrate up to 3/8 of an inch of steel plate. That meant the weapon could engage the side armor of most lightly armored vehicles, scout cars, half-tracks, early German Panzer I tanks, any French vehicles that had been captured and repurposed. The Germans in Normandy were operating a lot of captured French equipment in secondary roles, and American BAR gunners could and did disable those vehicles at short range. The bar was not designed as an anti-armor weapon, but within its limits, it was one of the few shoulder weapons in the American infantry that could hurt light armor at all. The weapon also had in practice a counter-sniper application. This surprises people because the bar was designed for close-range suppression. But American infantry in Europe figured out something quickly. If you suspected a German sniper was in a church tower or a farmhouse window or a specific position in a tree line, you did not send your sniper back at him. Your sniper might not be able to see him. What you did was task the bar gunner with a burst into the suspected position. 20 rounds of .30-06 into a window or a church belfry or a tree line made holding that position uncomfortable. Sometimes the sniper was killed outright. Sometimes he was driven out to another position the squad could see him moving to. Either way, the problem got solved. A staff sergeant in the 35th Infantry Division recorded that his squad's bar gunner, a man whose name the sergeant chose not to include in the report, had been credited with 11 confirmed German sniper kills over the course of 6 months in Europe, most of them accomplished by this method of burst fire into suspected positions. The records here are messy. Whether all 11 were statistically attributable to that gunner or whether he simply happened to be nearby when German snipers in his sector stopped firing is not recoverable, but the method worked, and it worked across many units. The bar became the infantry squad's answer to the German sniper, not because anyone had designed it to be, but because it turned out to be the most efficient tool available for the job. The bar was accurate, genuinely accurate. The weapon was effective out to about 600 yards in capable hands. Some accounts push the effective range to 1,000 yards with the bipod deployed and the gunner firing from a supported prone position. For comparison, an M1 Garand was considered effective to around 400 or 500 yards. The bar, with its longer barrel and heavier weight, was a better long-range shoulder weapon than the standard battle rifle, up to the point where its 20-round capacity became the limiting factor. The shower engagement in Italy included shots at 500 yards. That was not unusual for a skilled gunner. The bar could do the work of a designated marksman weapon before the concept of a designated marksman had been formalized. In a squad with a good bar gunner, he often became the de facto long-range shooter for the entire squad. Another role the weapon had not been designed for and accumulated naturally in the field. The average bar gunner. He was usually a teenager or in his early 20s. Drafted mostly, though the Marines disproportionately attracted volunteers. He had trained stateside for somewhere between 6 and 12 weeks of basic, plus whatever specialist instruction his unit provided. In some divisions, the bar gunner received additional training, a few days to a week of focused weapon work. In others, he got his BAR on the transport ship crossing the Atlantic and learned it from the previous gunner who had been rotated home. The quality of training varied enormously. A well-trained 1st Infantry Division bar gunner in 1943 knew things a green 99th Division replacement in 1944 did not know. How to change magazines under fire without looking. How to clear a specific jam that happened in cold weather. How to fire a controlled 3-round burst without the 4th round wandering off. The men who survived the initial combat period got very good very quickly. A bar gunner who made it through his first 2 months of combat often became one of the most effective soldiers in his squad. He had learned the weapon's quirks. He had learned to read terrain for firing positions. He had learned to move between positions under fire. He had learned when not to fire. Restraint was part of the skill. A gunner who fired at every movement he saw gave away his position and wasted ammunition. A gunner who held his fire until the situation genuinely demanded it and then produced accurate suppressive fire at the decisive moment was the man a platoon built its survival around. Those experienced gunners were rare by 1945. The attrition had eaten through them. Replacement bar gunners in the last months of the war in Europe were often men who had been trained to use the weapon but had never fired it in combat before arriving at the front. Their squads, in many cases, had lost multiple previous gunners. There is a compounding effect here. Less experienced gunners were more likely to be killed. When they were killed, even less experienced replacements took over. The skill level of the average bar gunner in a rifle squad declined through the last months of the war, even as the total number of bars in the field increased. Did the bar actually matter? Did this particular weapon, with all its limitations, its weight, its 20-round magazine, its fixed barrel that could not be changed in the field, actually change the shape of the war? The ballistic literature here is genuinely mixed. Military historians have argued both sides of this question for 80 years. The bar was not the best light machine gun of the war. It was not close, technically. The MG-42 was better. The MG-34 was better. The Bren gun had a quick-change barrel the bar lacked. The Soviet DP-27 held more rounds. On pure specifications, the bar was middle of the pack for a Second World War squad automatic weapon, maybe lower. Specifications are not the same thing as battlefield effect, and the battlefield effect of the bar has to be measured in the context of how the American infantry actually fought. The American infantry was the most well-supplied, well-trained, and well-supported infantry in the war, supported by overwhelming artillery, air superiority, and logistics. In that combined arms environment, the BAR's specific limitations mattered less. The weapon did not need to sustain fire like an MG-42 because American indirect fire support was so extensive that infantry engagements rarely required a single light machine gun to dominate a sector for long periods. A few minutes maybe, not the half-hour or hour that German light machine guns sometimes had to carry. Within those few minutes, the bar's mobility, the fact that one man could carry it and fight with it without a tripod or an assistant, gave the American squad something the German squad did not have: flexibility. An American squad could assault across broken ground faster than a German squad could, because the American squad did not have to drag a tripod-mounted gun with it. The bar stayed with the men. That mobility, multiplied across every squad in every division, shaped the American way of fighting in ways that are hard to measure statistically but are visible in the operational record. My honest read is this: the BAR was not the decisive weapon of the war. It just kept showing up at the exact moments where decisions were made. It was not even the most lethal weapon in a typical American squad. That was probably artillery support or air support. But within the infantry fight, at the squad level, the bar was the American weapon that made the American way of infantry combat possible. Without it, American squads would have moved differently, fought differently, and taken heavier casualties in the assault. With it, and with the men who were willing to carry it, knowing the casualty rates, the American infantry could do the kind of maneuvering that won battles like the Hedgerows, the Hurtgen Forest, the Vosges, the islands of the Pacific. Slow, grinding, costly maneuvering. But maneuvering. The men paid for that. They paid for it at a rate the official histories understated for decades, because unit statistics did not always break out bar gunners specifically. They were listed as riflemen, as infantrymen, as squad members killed in action. But the men in their units knew. The sergeants knew. The lieutenants knew. Whoever had the BAR that morning might not have it that evening, and it was not because the weapon had been discarded. One more thing worth bringing up, something that does not usually make it into the histories. The bar had a psychological weight on the gunner himself, not just the physical weight, the awareness. A bar gunner knew his role. He knew he was the squad's center of fire. He knew that when the shooting started, he would be firing first and most. He knew that whatever position he picked would be receiving incoming fire within seconds of his first burst. Some gunners wrote about that after the war in memoirs and letters and interviews. The feeling of being the target, The feeling of the first few days in combat when you learn, really learn, in your body, not in your training, that the German and Japanese infantry are specifically looking for you. Not for your lieutenant. You, the man with the 20-pound rifle and the muzzle flash that carries farther than anyone else's in the squad. Some of them broke under it. The term combat fatigue, which was how the army talked about psychological casualties in 1944, was more common among bar gunners than among regular riflemen. How much more common is another number the records do not quite support with precision. This part is debated, but the pattern was real enough that unit commanders noticed it. Bar gunners who had been in combat for extended periods often needed to be rotated out of the gunner role for a while. Not because of physical injury, but because the awareness had ground them down. A rifleman could hide. A BAR gunner had to advertise his position every time he did his job. That was the trade. Many of them kept doing the job anyway. That is the part I keep returning to when I read the veterans' accounts. They understood what they were carrying, and they carried it anyway, day after day for months, because the men next to them needed what the weapon could do. The war ended in 1945, but the bar did not. It went into Korea 5 years later and saw some of its hardest fighting there. Chinese and North Korean infantry tactics emphasized massed human wave attacks, which the bar was well suited to break up. The weapon's accuracy and the .30-06 rounds penetration meant a bar gunner could stop men at ranges beyond what the Chinese submachine guns could reach back. In the Korean winters, when other weapons froze, the bar kept firing. The open bolt action, the simple gas system, the lack of a quick change barrel that could cool unevenly, all of the design features that had been seen as drawbacks in temperate conditions became advantages in 20 below temperatures at the Chosun Reservoir. The bar kept working when heavier machine guns did not. Many Korean War veterans remembered the weapon more fondly than their European and Pacific counterparts did, not because it had changed, but because the conditions had changed in its favor. It went into Vietnam next, where it had a more limited role. The Army had moved on to the M60 General Purpose Machine Gun, which was a better weapon in the belt-fed sense, and the M14 and later M16 rifles. The BAR was provided to South Vietnamese units, to indigenous forces in various roles, and to some American special operations teams who preferred the weapon's penetration and accuracy for specific missions. One Marine officer who served in Vietnam in 1965, Jack Cummings, leading a combined Marines and South Vietnamese patrol, wrote about a Vietnamese bar gunner who stood up on a rice paddy dike during a firefight and opened up on a Viet Cong position, holding his ground in the open while the squad maneuvered. Cummings called him one of the bravest men he ever saw. The same weapon, in the same tactical role it had played at Co Quinh Nhi in 1944 and Lanzerath in 1944 and 100 other places before that. The weapon stayed in National Guard inventories into the mid-1970s. Foreign militaries kept it in service into the 1980s and 1990s. The design outlasted its designer by more than 70 years, and it outlasted most of the men who carried it. John Browning died in 1928, long before the weapon he had designed achieved its full reputation. He did not live to see a bar in Normandy. He did not live to see the weapon he had conceived in 1910 decide firefights in Pacific jungles 4 decades later. That gap between the designer and the full effect of the design is a quiet feature of firearms history. The man who invents the tool rarely lives to see what the world does with it. The bar gunner in a 1944 infantry squad was carrying something that made him more dangerous to his enemies and more visible to them at the same time. He was advancing across fields and through hedgerows and into jungles, knowing the weapon he held defined him as a target. His training was limited, his weapon was heavy, his ammunition was always about to run out, and his squad was depending on him to deliver fire at precisely the moment his position was being targeted in return. He did this job often with less than a year of military experience total. He did it in terrain he had never seen before, against enemies he had never met, using a weapon that in many cases he had first fired only a few weeks earlier. When he was hit, which happened at rates his unit records often do not quite articulate, the weapon changed hands. Another man picked it up. The squad kept moving. The fire kept going. Somewhere in a forward supply depot, another bar was coming up the line. Somewhere in a replacement depot, another 19-year-old was being told he had drawn the automatic rifle slot. The system absorbed losses at the individual level in a way that kept the squad functioning. That was, I suppose, the design. Not of the weapon, of the army. The men knew. That is what I keep coming back to. They knew what they were being asked to do, and they did it anyway. There is no mystery in that, but there is no simplicity either. Each of those decisions, to pick up the weapon, to move to the next position, to fire when firing was needed, happened in the mind of an individual man on an individual morning in an individual place. And we recover those decisions only in fragments, through the records that happened to be kept, through the letters that happened to survive, through the veterans who happened to be willing to talk about it later. Most of them did not talk about it later. That is worth saying. The majority of bar gunners who survived the war went home, got jobs, raised families, and said very little about what they had done. The memoirs that exist are a selection. The men who were willing to write. The veterans who talked to historians were the ones who were willing to be found. What we know about the BAR is filtered through what surviving gunners were willing to share. The rest, the men who made it home and chose silence, and the men who did not make it home at all, shaped the full reality of the weapon more than any written record will capture. An estimated 30-minute combat lifespan in a hot engagement, a weapon that weighed 20 pounds before you loaded the ammunition belt, a job that made the man carrying it the priority target for every enemy rifle within range. More than 500,000 rifles built across the war. Medal of Honor citations scattered across 3 wars and 4 decades. A tactical role that inverted between Army and Marine doctrine in the same campaign, in the same year, against different enemies. A weapon that was not the best of its kind by any specification that matters, and was still, somehow, at the center of almost every infantry firefight the American military fought for a generation. The BAR's story is the story of a weapon that earned more respect than its designer had probably intended, that cost more lives to use than the men carrying it had probably been told, and that outlasted most of the units it had served. It sits today in museums and in collectors' cases and in a small number of National Guard armories where it has been maintained more out of sentiment than need. The men who carried it are almost all gone. The weapons are still here. What I take away from the record, after working through it, is that the BAR's reputation is mostly accurate, but it needs a footnote. The weapon did everything the popular accounts say it did. The men who carried it earned every piece of respect attached to the job. What the popular accounts understate is the cost, not in design dollars or manufacturing hours. The cost in the specific men who happened to be carrying a specific weapon on a specific morning. That cost is distributed across hundreds of thousands of American squads and thousands of engagements, and it does not show up neatly in any single casualty table. It shows up in the gap between what the manuals claimed the BAR could do and what the men who used it actually paid to make that claim true. The Browning automatic rifle is a piece of 20th century American military history. The men who carried it are the larger piece. Both are worth knowing about, not because the weapon itself is romantic, because it was not, and not because the men were larger than life, because most of them were not. They were ordinary young men handed a specific job in a specific war, and they did it, at a cost, with a weapon that demanded more from them than the manuals had admitted. If this kind of story, the weapons, the men who carried them, the things the manuals left out, is worth continuing, you know what to do. More of it will be here when you want it.